What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this Saturday video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comments section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Also, if you're on TikTok, make sure you check out the Sit Down where we cover past and present crime and organized crime on a daily basis. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get in to another very interesting organized crime topic. And John Gotti is the most influential person, arguably, in the history of the Gambino crime family. A lot has been said about the Dapper Don over the years. There's one word we don't generally give to John Gotti: genius. Today, we're going to talk about one reason John Gotti was an absolute genius as the boss of the Gambino crime family, even after his arrest. We're going to tie it into a fairly little known gangster, a man who would rub shoulders and be involved with a major hit, and also down the road was on a committee after John Gotti went to prison. The story of the very interesting Stevie Coogan Grimalta next on the Sit Down. Stephen Grimalta was born way back on December 6th, 1916, and was from Manhattan. Stephen Grimalta would grow up in the area of 441 East 12th Street in the East Village. Now, Stephen Grimalta's father, Domenico Grimalta, was from the small area outside of Palermo of Mary. And as far as I know, Stevie Coogan's family came over in the early 1900s. Now, they had a big family, the Grimaltas. They had 7 children, including Stephen. Now, Grimalta and his family were from the East Village, and that would be helpful due to the fact that other family members lived in the area of East Village as well. It was said that Stevie Coogan's cousins were Stephen and Joseph Armone. Now, obviously, we know Joe Armone in his nickname, Joe Piney, but he actually had an older brother, about 15 years older than him, called Stephen Armone. And you probably don't know much about Stevie Armone, but he was a captain in the 40s and 50s in the Gambino crime family. And Grimalta's cousins would allow him to find his way into mob circles. Now, in his early 20s, Grimalta would marry a woman called Teresa in 1939, and they would live in the area of 500 East 11th Street in the East Village. According to the census in those times, at that time, Stephen Grimalta worked at a company called G. Cuccio and Sons, which was located on Houston Street in Manhattan. Now, I don't know what that company did per se due to the fact that it was so long ago, but as we've talked about time and time again, a lot of these guys that have these regular jobs, there's more to the jobs, and they don't just work at a regular job. They're involved in bookmaking or loan sharking or moving junk, and that's exactly what Grimalta did. Grimalta, alongside his cousins, the Armones, were major junk dealers, and in fact, during the 40s, they were some of the biggest drug dealers in the Gambino crime family. Armone, by this point, was a captain. His brother, Joe Piney, was involved. And I will talk about the indictment that Joe Piney and Stevie Coogan would have come down on them in the early 60s. But before we do that, it's important to realize that Stevie Coogan Grimalta was involved with a major hit and would down the road into his like 80s be involved with the Gambino family. Could you imagine interviewing this guy? I mean, so many interesting stories. But we have to talk about the hit on Albert Anastasia, which, look, as we know, if you know anything about the history of Albert, took place on October 25th, 1957. And according to a person called Alfred Santantonio, who was a mob informant in the early 60s, he would state that Stevie Coogan was the shooter of Albert Anastasia on October 25th, 1957, in the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan as he got a shave. Now, I want to post a lot of people over the course of history believe that the shooters of Albert Anastasia were Carmine Persico and Joey Gallo, which is complete nonsense. It never happened. And you would know that if you actually read the witness statements. They would state what these shooters looked like, and the age, the look, the height, none of it related to Persico and Gallo, but it was good story, and those guys took credit for it, but they weren't the shooters. The shooters were Stevie Coogan and a person called Joseph Cahill. And we would learn of that in documents, which I'm going to show. Now, the people that supposedly took part in planning this were people very connected to Carlo Gambino. Those individuals were Joseph Biondo, Staten Island Joe Riccobono, and Charlie Brush Dongara. And interestingly enough, after Albert Anastasia was taken out, these individuals were all either underboss, consigliere, and high-profile captains for the guy who just happens to take over, Carlo Gambino. This is shrewd Carlo Gambino in action. Now, I want to read Alfred Santantonio's statements regarding both the hit itself and why the Appalachian Conference originally was put in motion. There was a bigger reason they were all there in, about a year later in upstate New York. Now, according to the document, in an retail informant advised, the informant was Santantonio. The only purpose of the Appalachian meeting was to have a trial for Joe Cahill and Stevie Coogan, which we would find as Stevie Coogan, who killed Albert Anastasia. Santantonio stated that Steve is Steve Grimalta, 197 First Avenue, New York City, and his nickname is Stevie Coogan rather than Stevie Coogan. Informant San Antonio would state that the Appalachian meeting was a continuation of these individuals' trial, which trial had been held earlier in New Jersey, and he explained more in detail the reason for Anastasia's death and the Appalachian meeting as follows. Anastasia was supposedly, according to San Antonio, going to kill Riccobono, Biondo, and Dongara. Also, Joe Franco, a captain in the family and a close friend of Anastasia, learned of the plans to kill these three individuals and told them. Consequently, these three individuals, plus Andrew Alberti, Joseph Angallo, Steve Grimalta, and Joe Cahill, not a member of the family, but highly respected, got together and decided to kill Anastasia. Now, notice Carlo Gambino's name isn't mentioned, but he just happened to take over as boss after. Now, Cahill and Grimalta were given the contract. It was known that Anastasia frequented the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in New York City. Now, the guns for the hit were in the hotel room of a person called John Russo, who was at that time a boxer and nephew of Johnny Connecticut, John Russo. Cahill and Grimalta went to the hotel, got the guns, shot Anastasia, and caught a subway and went home. Sometime after the shooting, Joseph Riccobono then telephoned the owner of a liquor store at 78th Street, NYC, who was at the present time the collector of Gambino's assessments, and told him that one in his, Riccobono's family, had done the shooting without naming names. This liquor store owner knew all the captains and was to pass the word along. Riccobono then advised Tommy Lucchese and Vito Genovese that someone in his family had whacked Anastasia. Riccobono requested a meeting be held so he could explain the shooting. There was a meeting held in New Jersey, and those present were including Tommy Lucchese, Vito Genovese, Riccobono, Joe Biondo, Charles Curry from New Jersey, Tony Anastasia, Johnny Roberts, and Tommy Raven. And all those names are some nicknamed, but this is the conspiracy to whack Anastasia. And even though history tells us that Persico and Gallo did it on behalf of Gambino, it's bullshit. The Gambino crime family handled it, and the chief hitter was Stephen Grimalta. Now, it must be made important that Coogan, Grimalta, and Joe Cahill were never even indicted for this. The shooters of Albert Anastasia are still unknown, though history pretty much tells us who it was. So they never faced anything on this. Now, we will get further proof that Coogan did this in a later quote I'm going to read you from someone all of you know. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Stevie Coogan and his narcotics pushing in retrospect and in connection with Joe Piney. These guys were both involved in moving junk, and a lot of it occurred between 1956 and 1960. And Piney and Gramanta made a lot of money selling junk. Now, their drugs originated in France and would be smuggled into the country with the aid of couriers who traveled. For example, one of the people involved as couriers was a person called Clarence Aspelin, who was a seaman who would transport H for exporter Marius Aranci in Marseille, France. Also involved was a person called Charles Bourbonnier, a flight purser who would bring in the narcotics for Felix Bernier in Paris. Now, what these couriers would do was initially deliver their narcotics once in the country to Joe Cahill, who we just talked about, whose base of operations were in New York. Eventually, a person called Charles Hedges would take over Cahill's role, and Joe Armone, one of the importers, would direct the eventual sale of the narcotics to domestic wholesalers, including Vincent Pacelli and Stephen Grimalta. Now, Nicholas Viscardi acted as a store of the narcotics as a pending delivery to the wholesalers. Now, a little bit more about this whole thing. Mr. Aspelin would meet Joe Cahill in New York and therefore report to his principal that Cahill had requested narcotics. 6 to 8 kilos would then be delivered by way of Norfolk, Virginia, to the New York harbor. For the next 3 years, Aspelin would bring in heroin for Cahill about 3 times a year. Bourbonnier would then also bring on narcotics for Cahill, several kilos at a time. Now, on occasion, Charles Hedges would also meet with Armone directly at an Anvitz club to discuss some of the aspect of the dealings with the export couriers. Payment from wholesalers were often turned over to Armone or Grimalta, as latter became involved in the sale for importers. So these guys were heavily involved in moving H over a 4 to 5 year period and were ultimately indicted. Stevie Coogan was hit with 8 years in federal prison. Joe Piney Armone would be hit with 15 years. Now, the late 60s and 70s would play themselves out, and eventually Stevie Coogan would get out of prison. Now, for various parts of his life in the mob, he would not only be in the crew of Stephen Armone, but Joe Piney Armone. Now, I want to talk about an interesting quote from former Gambino captain, eventual government cooperator, and now YouTuber Mikey Scars DiLeonardo. He would state at one point that he once saw Stevie Coogan Grimalta at a social club and didn't know who he was. At that point, his mentor, a person called Paulie Zacharia, would nudge him saying, quote, "You know, that's the guy who did the work on Albert," to Scars. So this was common knowledge that surrounding Gambino circles is that Grimalta was a respected guy, and he had been around so long that he did the work on Albert, and that these young gangsters should kind of like pay some homage to him. Pretty incredible, quite honestly. Now, I want to get to why John Gotti is a genius. And we've heard over the years John talked too much, which he did, but so did a lot of mob guys. He was always wanting attention, which, again, I don't think you're wrong, but there are also things that make John Gotti really smart. And one of the reasons is throughout his time as boss, once he got arrested, even when he was in prison and delegated his son Junior take over, Junior was not the only decision maker. He was the final decision maker, but John realized he wasn't smart enough to deal with other people. So they created committees, which a lot of families have done. But John Gotti, even in his time as boss, he always made sure, even though he didn't necessarily like them, he always made sure that the old guys, the old timers, were happy. Guys like Joe Lafort, who at one point John Gotti called a heartless motherfucker. That said, he provided John Gotti with a great living, and Joe was a huge earner. He wanted to make sure Joe was happy. He made sure guys like Joe Arcuri were happy. Jimmy Brown, Stevie Coogan, Joe Piney, all of these guys, even though a lot of them were Castellano loyalists, they were smart enough to A, get in line, and B, John Gotti realized that to run this family effectively, for me to be boss, down the road when I go to prison, for my son to take over, I have to make sure these people are happy. And remember, they're all Castellano loyalists, and they decided to get in line and shut up. You even look at a guy like Joe Gallo. Joe Gallo had been a consigliere for 30 years. He didn't buck one instance when they said they were going to whack Paul. He said, I can't be involved, but I'll get in line and I'm not going to buck. John realized getting people like Piney on his side, Jimmy Brown, they had to have their own level and they had to say what they wanted to say and do what they wanted to do. They had to be taken care of. And in the mid-90s, when John was in prison and his son took over, one of the people on the Gambino family committee at that time was Stevie Coogan Grimalta. And this has just been due to the fact that he had been around forever. Remember, his cousin, Joe Piney, had died in 1992. He takes over. He's the guy now. And he was respected. Now, Stevie Coogan would be seen publicly for the last time in the mid-2000s at the funeral of Joseph Arcuri, who would die in the mid-2000s. He would spend the rest of his life, the next 10 years or so, basically retired. He lived in the area of this housing apartment on 75th Avenue in Oakland Gardens, Queens. Stephen Grimalta would die in 2016 at the ripe old age of 100. In his 70-year, probably 80-year mob career, he did about 5 years in prison and died in an apartment alone. He probably walked to the bakery every day. I've always said to myself, you ever think about how many people you've walked past that have had lives like this? These old people you think you see this guy on the street, right? You're thinking he's somebody's grandfather or, he probably doesn't even know where he is. This guy whacked Albert Anastasia. I'm sure this guy had young neighbors in his apartment building. They probably just knew him. Hey, Mr. Stevie, how are you? They never knew he was the guy who whacked Albert Anastasia, was on the sitting committee of bosses for the Gambino Crime Family in their heyday, made millions of dollars selling junk, and died alone at 100 years old. The saddest thing about this genre is not all the drama or the failed talent or whatever. It's the fact that people like this will never tell their story. And that's the sad thing about this genre. People like Stevie Coogan, Jackie Nose D'Amico, Joe Arcuri, Joe Lafort, Jimmy Brown, all these people die and never tell their story. Could you imagine interviewing this guy, sitting down with him for 6-8 hours? The kind of shit you would hear. This is what made me want to get into this genre. It's so freaking fascinating, and it made me want to tell their stories for them. That is why I got into this, because people like this, they're not to be respected or fawned over, but they are here to be learned from. And that's where I'll relate this to some of the recent drama going on. OC Shorts is right on one level. We're all just here to tell stories. And that's why, whether you like me, you like him, you like any of us, this is why we need to be respected, because we are the only ones telling stories of people like this. They're not to be fawned over, like I said, but their stories are meant to be told. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.